The night my husband laughed and called me just a housewife is something I will never forget. We were sitting at the dinner table with a few of his coworkers. The room was warm, the food was on the table, and everyone seemed relaxed. I had spent most of the day cooking and cleaning because Dorian wanted everything to look perfect for his guests. During dinner, one of his colleagues joked about how lucky Dorian was to have someone who handled the house while he focused on his career. I expected Dorian to say something kind, maybe something about how much work I did for our family. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and laughed. "Let's be honest," he said with a smile. "Corinne's just a housewife." The table went quiet for a moment, and then a few people laughed along with him. Someone raised their glass like it was a harmless joke. But for me, it felt like something sharp had cut through the room. I smiled politely, because I didn't want to make the evening awkward. Inside, though, I felt small. For 10 years, I had supported him. I took care of our home, raised our daughter, and helped him build the life he now showed off to his friends. Yet in one careless sentence, he made it sound like none of that mattered. The rest of the dinner passed slowly. People talked about work, money, and business deals. I cleared plates, refilled glasses, and kept my expression calm. Dorian continued laughing with his colleagues like nothing had happened. But something had changed inside me. That night, when everyone finally left and the house was quiet again, I sat alone in the kitchen thinking about his words. The more I replayed that moment in my mind, the more I realized something important. Dorian believed I was invisible. He believed I was too simple to understand his world. And that belief would turn out to be the biggest mistake he ever made. People outside our home believed Dorian and I had a perfect life. From the outside, it looked like a dream. We lived in a quiet neighborhood with wide streets and tall trees. Our house was large enough that visitors always complimented it the moment they stepped inside. Dorian drove a luxury car, wore expensive suits, and worked as a financial executive at a respected investment firm. Everyone admired him. At neighborhood gatherings, people asked him about the market and investments. They listened carefully when he spoke, as if every word he said carried importance. When he introduced me, he would place a hand on my shoulder and say, "This is my wife, Corinne." Most people smiled warmly at me, but the attention always returned to him. I had once worked in accounting before our daughter Eliza was born. After she arrived, Dorian suggested it would be better if I stayed home. He said his income was more than enough, and that our daughter deserved a parent who was always there for her. At the time, I believed him. I thought we were making the decision together. Over the years, my world slowly became smaller. My days were filled with school runs, groceries, laundry, and keeping the house running smoothly. I handled bills, appointments, repairs, everything that kept our life organized. Dorian's world, however, became bigger. His job brought promotions, travel, and powerful connections. He often came home late from meetings or business dinners. When he'd talk about work, the conversations were short and distant, like I wouldn't understand the details anyway. At first, I didn't question it. But little things began to change in the way he treated me. Sometimes when I asked about his day, he would shrug and say, "It's complicated finance stuff." Other times he would make comments that sounded harmless, but felt dismissive. "You're lucky you don't have to deal with the pressure I do," he once said while loosening his tie. I remember nodding quietly, even though something about that sentence didn't sit right with me. Still, I told myself this was normal. Many couples lived like this. One partner worked outside the home while the other handled things inside it. But after that dinner with his coworkers, I began to see our marriage differently. I started noticing how often Dorian spoke about success, status, and money, but almost never about family. And slowly, a quiet question began to grow in my mind. Was our life really as perfect as everyone believed? A few weeks after that dinner, Dorian decided to host another small gathering at our house. This time it was only a few of his closest colleagues. He told me it would be simple, but I still spent most of the day preparing the house. I cleaned every room, arranged the table carefully, and cooked the dishes he liked to serve when important people visited. By evening, the house looked perfect. When the guests arrived, Dorian greeted them loudly at the door, shaking hands and smiling like he owned the world. I stood nearby, welcoming everyone and taking their coats. The conversation quickly filled the living room with loud voices and confident laughter. Most of their talk was about work, investments, deals, and numbers I barely heard Dorian explain before. I moved quietly between the kitchen and the dining room, bringing drinks and snacks while they continued their discussions. At one point, a man named Grant Hollis looked around the house and said, "Dorian, you've got it good. Big house, great job, and someone who keeps everything running here." Everyone looked toward me for a moment. Before I could say anything, Dorian laughed and leaned back in his chair. "Yeah," he said casually, waving his hand toward me. "Corinne handles the house. That's her department." Grant smiled and said, "Must be nice having someone take care of all that." Dorian took a sip from his glass and added the words that froze the room for me. "Let's be honest. She's just a housewife." A few people chuckled. Someone nodded like it was a harmless joke. The conversation quickly moved on, but my ears were still ringing from that sentence. I kept serving food like nothing had happened. My face stayed calm, and I even forced a small smile when someone thanked me for dinner. But inside, something heavy settled in my chest. I realized that Dorian truly believed those words. To him, the years I spent supporting our family, raising our daughter, and managing our home meant very little. In his world, success only counted if it came with money, titles, and business deals. Later that night, after the guests left and the house was finally quiet again, I stood in the kitchen washing dishes. The water ran over my hands while his words repeated again and again in my mind. Just a housewife. For the first time, I didn't feel hurt. I felt something else. Awake. And that was the moment I started paying attention to things I had ignored for years. In the days after that dinner, I started noticing small things that I had ignored before. At first, they seemed ordinary, but the more I paid attention, the stranger they felt. Dorian had always worked long hours, but now his schedule seemed even more unpredictable. Some nights he stayed at the office very late. Other nights, he stepped outside to take phone calls, speaking in a low voice like he didn't want anyone inside the house to hear. Once, when he came home after midnight, I heard him pacing in the living room while talking on the phone. I couldn't understand every word, but I clearly heard him say, "No paper trail." That's important. When he noticed me standing in the hallway, he quickly ended the call and told me it was just a business discussion. I nodded, but something about his tone felt rushed. Another thing I began to notice was the paperwork he brought home. Dorian often carried a leather briefcase that he usually kept near his desk in the study. Before, I never had a reason to look through it. I trusted him completely. But now my curiosity had grown. One afternoon while he was at work, I went into the study to clean. His briefcase was sitting beside the desk. It wasn't locked. I told myself I was only going to move it while dusting the table. Still, my eyes drifted toward the documents inside. Most of the papers looked like normal financial reports. Charts, numbers, investment summaries. But mixed between them were a few printed sheets that looked different. They showed transfers between accounts I didn't recognize. The numbers were large, much larger than anything I usually saw in household finances. At first, I assumed they were related to his company's clients. But something felt odd about the formatting and the account names. They didn't look like official company documents. I placed the papers back exactly where I found them before closing the briefcase. That evening, when Dorian returned home, he acted like everything was normal. He talked about a meeting he had earlier and asked what we were having for dinner. I watched him quietly while he spoke. For years, I had believed I knew this man better than anyone. But now I realized there were parts of his life I had never truly seen. And the strange thing was, the more I noticed, the more questions began to appear. Questions I couldn't ignore anymore. A few days later, I went back into Dorian's study while he was at work. I told myself I was only organizing the room, but the truth was I couldn't stop thinking about those strange documents I had seen in his briefcase. The house was quiet that afternoon. Our daughter Eliza was at school, and the sunlight from the window fell across Dorian's desk. Everything looked neat, almost too neat, like he wanted the room to appear perfectly controlled. His briefcase was sitting in the same place as before. For a moment, I hesitated. Opening it again felt like crossing a line. But the memory of that dinner and the strange phone calls pushed me forward. I slowly opened the case and took out the stack of papers I had noticed earlier. This time I read them more carefully. They were not normal company reports. The pages showed detailed records of money moving between several different bank accounts. Some accounts had names that looked like businesses, but others were just numbers with no clear identity. The amounts were shocking. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moving in and out within short periods of time. I checked the dates and realized the transfers had been happening regularly for years. The records looked organized, almost like someone had carefully tracked everything privately. My heart started beating faster as I turned the pages. I had studied accounting years ago, and even though I hadn't worked in that field for a long time, the patterns in those numbers were easy to recognize. This didn't look like normal investment activity. It looked like money being moved quietly through hidden channels. There were also notes written in Dorian's handwriting beside some transactions. Short reminders and initials that probably meant something to him. One line caught my attention immediately. It showed a large transfer connected to a client account I had heard him mention many times at home. But the destination account listed on the page wasn't part of his company. It was private. At that moment, a cold realization settled in my mind. If these documents were accurate, Dorian wasn't just managing money for clients. He was moving their funds somewhere they would never expect. And that meant something much bigger than a mistake was happening. I carefully placed every document back into the briefcase exactly the way I found them. When I closed it, my hands were slightly shaking. For the first time, I understood that my husband might be hiding something far more serious than I had imagined. And now that I had seen it, I couldn't pretend everything was normal anymore. After discovering those records, I knew I had to be careful. If Dorian realized I had seen those documents, he might hide everything before I understood what was really happening. So I acted like nothing had changed. That evening when he came home, I greeted him the same way I always did. Asked about his day, and served dinner like our routine had never been disturbed. Dorian talked about work for a few minutes, and then started complaining about how stressful his job had become. He spoke with the same confident tone he always used, like he was the smartest person in every room. While he talked, I watched him closely. The strange thing was how relaxed he seemed. There was no sign that he was worried about anything. He ate his dinner, checked his phone a few times, and told me about a meeting he had scheduled later that week. At one point, he glanced at the stack of household bills on the counter and said casually, "You know, Corinne, you're lucky you don't have to deal with complicated financial decisions." I looked at him quietly. "Most people wouldn't understand the kind of work I handle," he continued. "It takes experience." His words were calm, but the meaning behind them was clear. He believed I couldn't possibly understand his world. And that belief made him comfortable. Over the next several days, I paid closer attention to everything he did. I noticed when he carried new documents into the study. I noticed the nights when he stayed up late reviewing papers alone. Sometimes he would lock the study door when he was working, but he never locked his briefcase. That small detail became important. Whenever he left for work, I carefully looked through the documents again. Each time I found new pages showing more transactions and account numbers. I started writing down the details quietly in a small notebook I kept hidden in the kitchen drawer. Date after date, transfer after transfer. The pattern became clearer with every page. Dorian wasn't just making risky decisions. He was moving large amounts of money through accounts that were never meant to be connected to each other. And the more I understood those records, the more one thing became certain in my mind. The man who believed I was powerless had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Because the housewife he laughed about was now the only person who truly knew what he had been doing. After weeks of quietly studying the documents, I realized something important. If I rushed or confronted Dorian too early, he would deny everything and hide the evidence. I needed to be patient, so I started building a plan. Every time he left for work, I carefully checked the briefcase again. I wrote down account numbers, dates, and the amounts of money that were being moved. I made copies of a few important pages when I had the chance. Each document went into a folder I kept hidden in a storage box in the basement. I worked slowly and carefully, so nothing looked disturbed. At night, while Dorian slept, I sat at the kitchen table reviewing the notes I had collected. The pattern was becoming clearer. Money from client accounts was being transferred into private accounts and then moved again through different banks. It looked complicated, but the goal seemed simple: hide where the money was really going. One evening, after writing down another series of transfers, I realized the situation was bigger than I could handle alone. These were not small amounts of money. The totals were reaching into the millions. I needed advice. The next day, I drove to another town about 40 minutes away. I didn't want anyone near our neighborhood recognizing me. There, I scheduled a quiet meeting with a lawyer named Bennett Crowley, someone who specialized in financial cases. When I showed him a few copies of the documents, his expression changed immediately. He read the pages slowly, asking careful questions about where the information came from. I answered honestly, but kept my voice calm. After several minutes, he leaned back in his chair and said something that confirmed what I had already suspected. These records suggest serious financial fraud. Hearing those words out loud made the situation feel real in a new way. Mr. Crowley explained that cases involving large financial transfers often attracted the attention of federal investigators. If the documents were accurate, the authorities would want to see them. Before I left his office, he carefully placed the copies back into an envelope and gave me one piece of advice. "Do not confront your husband," he said. "If he realizes what you know, the evidence could disappear overnight." As I drove home that afternoon, I understood something clearly. Dorian still believed I was just a quiet housewife who didn't understand his world. And that misunderstanding was giving me the time I needed to finish what I had started. After my meeting with Mr. Crowley, things started moving slowly, but carefully. He told me that the documents needed to be reviewed by professionals who understood financial crime investigations. A few days later, he arranged for me to meet someone he trusted. The meeting took place in a small office building downtown. The man who greeted me introduced himself as Adrian Keller. He worked with investigators who specialized in complex financial cases. I handed him the envelope containing copies of the documents. Adrian didn't rush through them. He examined every page closely, occasionally writing notes on a pad beside him. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of paper turning. After a long moment, he looked up at me. "These transactions are unusual," he said carefully. "If they are connected the way they appear, this could involve a large fraud scheme." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach hearing those words again. Adrian explained that before anything official could happen, investigators would need time to study the financial trails. Money moved through multiple accounts could take weeks or even months to trace properly. But he also said something that surprised me. "The information you brought us is very important," he added. "It may help us understand a much larger situation." From that day forward, I stayed in contact with Mr. Crowley while the investigators quietly reviewed everything. Occasionally they asked for additional details, dates, account numbers, or copies of other records I had seen. Each time, I carefully gathered what they needed. Meanwhile, life at home continued as if nothing had changed. Dorian still left early every morning wearing his expensive suits. He still spoke about meetings, investments, and business plans at dinner. Sometimes he even complained about clients who asked too many questions about their accounts. Listening to those conversations felt strange now. He had no idea that professionals were slowly examining the same transactions he believed were hidden. Weeks turned into months. During that time, the investigators quietly followed the money trails through banks and private accounts. Every new discovery added another piece to the puzzle. The picture they were building was becoming bigger than anyone first expected. And the most surprising part was that Dorian never seemed worried. He still believed his secrets were completely safe. Months passed while the investigation continued quietly. During that time, life in our house stayed almost the same on the surface. Dorian still went to work every morning, dressed perfectly and confident as always. He talked about meetings and new clients, never showing the slightest sign that anything was wrong. But I knew things were moving in the background. Occasionally, Mr. Crowley would call to update me. He didn't share every detail, but he told me the investigators were following the financial trails carefully. The money had moved through many different accounts, across several banks, and even through shell companies. The more they looked, the bigger the situation became. One morning, about 6 months after that dinner party, I was making breakfast when my phone rang. It was Mr. Crowley. His voice was calm, but direct. "They're ready," he said. Later that day, events moved quickly. Federal agents arrived at Dorian's office building during working hours. I wasn't there to see it, but I later learned that investigators had already gathered enough evidence to move forward with official charges. Documents were collected, computers were secured, and several employees were questioned. By the evening, the news had reached Dorian. He came home earlier than usual that night. The confident expression he always carried was gone. Instead, he looked tense and distracted. He barely spoke during dinner and kept checking his phone as if waiting for another call. Over the next few days, everything changed. Lawyers became involved, meetings were scheduled, and eventually Dorian was required to appear in federal court. The case had grown into a serious financial investigation involving millions of dollars. The morning of the first court hearing, the courtroom felt heavy with silence. Dorian stood with his attorneys at the front while officials read through the formal charges. When he turned slightly, his eyes moved across the room. For a brief moment, our eyes met. I was sitting quietly behind the investigators. And in that instant, something in his expression changed. It was the moment he realized the truth. The person he believed understood nothing about his world had been watching everything all along. The courtroom felt cold and quiet as the hearing continued. Dorian stood beside his lawyers, listening while the judge reviewed the charges connected to the financial investigation. The confident man who once spoke proudly about his career now looked tense and uncertain. I remained seated quietly in the back row. For years I had watched him walk into rooms with complete control, always believing he was the smartest person there. But that day was different. The situation around him was no longer something he could manage with confidence or charm. The judge spoke clearly about the evidence gathered during the investigation. Detailed financial records had traced money through hidden accounts and private companies. The transfers involved millions of dollars taken from clients who trusted the firm to manage their investments honestly. Every document, every transaction, every step had been carefully examined. And many of those first documents had come from the papers I found in his briefcase. Dorian kept his eyes forward while the charges were explained, but I could see the tension in his face. His lawyers whispered to him occasionally, pointing at papers and making quiet notes. The hearing eventually ended with more court dates scheduled for the months ahead. As people slowly began leaving the room, Dorian finally turned his head and looked across the courtroom again. This time he looked directly at me. For a moment neither of us moved. There was no anger in his expression, only a deep realization. He understood now how everything had started. The quiet person he had dismissed for years had been paying attention all along. I stood up calmly and walked toward the exit without saying a word. Outside, the air felt cool and fresh. The city moved normally around the courthouse, cars passing, people walking, life continuing like any other day. But for me, everything felt different. For years, I had lived inside a life built around someone else's success. I had accepted the small role he believed I belonged in. Now that chapter was finished. Because sometimes the people others overlook are the ones who see the truth most clearly. And the man who once laughed about me being just a housewife had finally learned that underestimating someone can change everything.